With most of our participants today being faced with many challenges from the upcoming cybersecurity maturity model certification mandate, you probably have dozens of questions like, where do I start? Or is my current IT environment CMMC ready? Great questions. But KAMIND believes the first question you should really be asking is, when should I get started? And Matt will give you the answer to that question during today's presentation. So please welcome our presenter today, KAMIND's President and CEO, Mr. Matt Katzer.
Well, thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone. And CMC, this is really an interesting and very dear to my heart because back years ago, I did a lot of projects with the Intel security teams and flew back and forth to Baltimore, for discussions with the feds at the time. So it's really kind of interesting to see all this come to fruition. And it's really kind of fascinating, the changes, because philosophy, from a fundamental philosophy standpoint, the way KAMIND operates, we believe security is paramount. And everything and every client that we actually touch, we always put a level of security in place for protection. And as we manage 40,000 endpoints, it's really interesting as we kind of handle the different issues that we come across. Now, with the whole COVID and what's happened with COVID-19, there's a slide that I always like to show. This kind of gives an idea of what's happening because business is going through this digital transformation. It's been going on for years and everything else. But you see, what you're really seeing, and Sadia said it very well in this, is that the speed of execution is phenomenal. You're seeing years of worth of digital transformation changes done in 2 months. And you're seeing this constant repeat over and over and over again. And even for ourselves, even as our business has changed, now we're Inc. 5000 for a third year in a row, we see the same type of activity that's going. It's just this constant changing. How do you actually do things? How do you actually make better accountability? How do you actually communicate with people in terms of two-dimensional, three-dimensional? And this is kind of an important piece because as we get into the remote workforce, as we work from home in this hybrid environment, we have this CMMC, even though say DoD standards, becoming more broad across the entire industry. And we're looking at things and they're all worried about the same thing. Is what about the data risk, in terms of work from home or in terms of the environment, how you actually protect it? What about trying to get a baseline in terms of an assessment? And that's what CMMC tries, it does, is what the level set everything. And you have to go through discovery of where the risk is associated with this, what's really happening and how does this really impact the way we're doing business? And if you're doing business with the federal government under Department of Defense contracts, you have to protect against federal contract information, and also CUI, which is confidential unclassified information. Those are requirements of the contract. And then on top of it is that if you actually have an active federal contract, you also have you're required to do a NIST 800-171 assessment and do a SPRS filing. And that's for the Supplier Performance Risk System for the federal government to be awarded contracts. Now, all this is kind of interesting. A lot of people say, hey, well, we don't have federal contracts. What does it really mean to me? Well, that's kind of what we're talking about what's on today, because right now it's looking in terms of information that is going in, because with the new administration, cybersecurity is now becoming the #1 objective of the organization. So what we're seeing is that the DoD standard for CMMC is now becoming the standard that's going to be put out through the industry. We're seeing this in GSA. We're seeing this impact in terms of New York, in terms of SHIELD Act. So a lot of things are just fundamental. And yes, as we're talking about CMMC, how it affects us today, but also it's going to be a broader effect. It is going to touch us in all businesses, regardless if we have federal contracts or not. And that's the key thing. And we as IT professionals and business owners have to really look from an organization, how do we actually put the necessary tools in place so that when we're actually required to go through a process of accreditation, we have the necessary data collected and we have the maturity process. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is really what CMMC is, so you understand what the requirements and what we're all going to be facing. A little bit about KAMIND, for instance, is that KAMIND is an IT, is a CMMC RPO. We provide 2 styles of licenses for the environment for CMMC. And one of those licenses is the corporate licenses, and the other one is known as GCC High. Those are the government restricted compliance licenses. And we do different types of areas. We also provide assistance on a readiness checks and make sure that things are in place, but also from the monitoring, because CMMC requires a continuous monitoring and improvement process. It's not like the old days when you actually would sign an agreement that says, yes, check, I did this or did that, or hire a consultant come in. This is a continuous entire process and a continuous audit. And so you have to mentally think of this as CMMC as a kind of fundamental security business chain. And we're aligned a lot with Microsoft directions in terms of templates, and we are the first RPO in Oregon. So when you talk about CMMC, we talked a little bit about it. It's really a holistic approach to security. And basically what the whole thing is that when you look at CMMC, in the past you would have different organizations that would do assessments, like doing a NIST 800 171 assessment or something else. But what would happen is there would be no standards body that basically would oversee that. What happened with CMMC is that now there's a separate mechanism in place to basically do verification. So it's not just doing implementation, you have to actually go through an accreditation. And that's really what it's set up for. And it's really designed to do two things: protect federal contract information and controlled unclassified information. And it's driven by the DoD. Now, the question is that why is all this being put in place? Well, you've seen a lot of things with the Chinese, with the embassy being shut down down in Texas. But you look and really what the impact is, and this is probably a good pictorial what happened. The whole CMMC, or the cybersecurity standard, became driven because of this one thing, is that in the screenshot you see two pictures. One is the F-35 and the other is the Chinese J-31. And what happened is they basically, excavation contractor had the entire set of plans, and the Chinese basically got into the excavation contractor, took the entire set of plans for the F-35 and cloned it and produced it. So when you think about business, and from our standpoint, we're all taxpayers. How many billions of dollars have been basically lost because we didn't put the necessary hooks in place? And that's what the whole base is when you look at where CMMC coming from. It's about putting a fundamental standard. And the way that DoD approached it is they looked at it from a standpoint, because everyone looked at cybersecurity as this pillar add-on. As you see, this is that you see this kind of this pillar that sits on the side for cybersecurity. The big change now is that basically put the cybersecurity as a fundamental building block, and you build everything on top of it. And so you have an environment where basically it's fundamental to the mindset, the way things are put together. And as part of this whole cybersecurity model for CMMC, they compose really of two things. There's what we call, in terms of domains, so it's the model encompasses the different activities, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But there's really two key parts of it. There's processes and practices. When you think of practices, are capabilities of organizations, those are things that are performed at each of the domains. But processes are really the process maturity. Those are the things that you're going to do on a day-to-day basis. And notice that I said on the day-to-day basis. So when you look at CMMC, you're not looking at just it's a one and done checklist. You're looking at how do you actually put something in place that you can continue on. Now, when you're looking at a little bit more on CMMC, there's a progression that you actually have with it. You have different levels. There's 5 levels in CMMC, one from kind of basic cyber all the way up to advanced progressive. And typically organizations and small businesses, you're going to be at level 1, and most contracts, and you're going to have some contracts cover level 3. Now there's different requirements for Office 365. Now we're going to talk a little bit about that later, and so you get an idea. I just want to give you an idea of the basis of the pieces of it. Those that don't know what FCI is, that's a federal contract information. Basically, it's not intended for public release. So when you have all that contract information associated with it, that's not public and has to be protected. Now, controlled unclassified information, the government contract will define what that is. And that's also there's a link on this for the National Archives, so you can actually look at the different category lists. And kind of keep in mind, this is just not necessarily DoD, so we're seeing this go into the General Services Administration now. I mean, you could, like DHR, Department of Natural Resources, for instance, looking at scoping in terms of what's the water flow of the various environments, how many earthworms are in a certain square. Those are the type of things that could be classified as CUI, just like personal information as well. So you have to be aware of what's being in place. Now, these are things that we as good stewards and environments from an IT standpoint should manage. And the third concept we talked about in this is known as GCC High. This is a version of 365 that is restricted for government or defense contractors, and I'll show what you mean. And some other just terms I have, I'm not going to walk through these. KAMIND is an RPO, and what I did want to bring out is that the way CMMC is structured is that whoever does the implementation in an organization cannot do the assessment. And whoever does the formal assessment cannot do the implementation. And that's kind of the structure of it. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that when you talk about CMMC and you talk about the Department of Defense, there is a timeline. And basically, the clock is ticking. And the clock ticking basically saying that come October 1st of 2025, everything, and if you're going to bid on a contract or if you have an existing contract, you have to basically be compliant. And that's just, and if you're not compliant, you're not going to be able to bid on it. And so as a new contracts, because typically DoD contracts get issued in the fall and they got started for the spring, they get approved in the fall and they issue in the spring. So anything in 2026 will require CMMC certification. And keep in mind that in the past, what's happened is when you have, when you actually would create plans, like you do in NIST 800-171 filing, you may have a plan of action and milestones of how you're actually going to do different types of, how to actually get like multi-factor authentication, how to actually get some other security things in place. And you might not have those on the contract under the original, the older NIST 800-171 clauses. And then in order to actually get the contract, you have to have a plan to show how you're going to get there. Those days are gone. There is no plan. CMC is an accreditation of the domains at the time of assessment. And so when you actually do contracts, you basically have to be fully implemented. So in terms of what's the driving of all this, and it started last year in November, there was an interim rule that was pushed out. And basically, if you have an existing a contract with DoD, you're required to do a SPURS filing. That's a supplier performance risk service system. And you basically have to do a scoring. And a scoring shows that what is your maturity, what is basically in the confidence. And so you end up with a score that has to be filed on the DoD and linked to your contract. And what the DoD looks at when they award contracts is they look at that information, say, I have these 10 suppliers, and this one has a risk score of 100, this one has a risk score of -50, and this one has a risk score of 30. So if you're a contract officer and you look through this and you're trying to award which one should go to the 3 contractors, how do you think that's going to affect? How do you want to feel in that ranking? So that's the pieces that goes in place. You have to basically address the things, make sure you have the necessary tools in place. Now, this past year in May, there's another change that happened. And this is a recent executive order that was published by the current administration. Basically, they're rolling everything not only into the defense environment, that's called the DFARS, they're also rolling it into the FAR with the General Services Administration. So they're basically moving everything forward. So it's going to become it's going to impact all us doing business. Now, how does an IT service company that doesn't have any DoD contracts, how does it impact us, for instance? Well, if we actually have a client that's at level 3, we have to be at level 3 or higher ourselves, and we have to be accredited at level 3. Just like if you're in a business supplying services to a third party and they're at level 3, if you actually have to touch information that has CUI for that, you have to be in the same level as well. And that's the whole thing that you see on the pieces on the see from, in terms of contracts. So you have to be able to offer the services at the level that you basically are, that you're going to touch the information. And generally for IT service firms, you're going to have to be at level 1, because if any companies has, and we're seeing this with not-for-profits, they're going to have basically government contracts and grants that are going to have FCI information that's going to be protected. The game rules are changing, and they're changing fast. So the key thing to look in terms of what you do is basically you got to get the scoring in place, and it has to be can't be more than 3 years old, and you have to actually file it with SPURS. And from a strategy standpoint, if you're having a contractor trying to look at what you're doing, and that's really comes through with what what we call our 4 steps. And the strategies on accreditation is really, it's a very simple. You have to kind of look at the environment and you approach it from this model where you're going to do a scoring on the 110 controls and doing the NIST if you have an existing contract. You then have to scope it. And scope I mean is you're going to look and saying, where's CUI in the organization? Where's FCI? How is the internal organization structured? What are the data flows between the organization? Does data mix between 2 parts of the organization? Might not even have CUI information in the organization, which is perfectly fine. So you kind of have to figure out the pieces. And that's what you actually have in terms of when you look in terms of CMMC. You know, you want to try to, first of all, you want to get a score from a standpoint how mature are you? And the second part is that you got to look in terms of, from the contract standpoint, where is the scoping of it? Where does information touch? Who actually is touching and what data flows? So there's a lot of information that you have to put together to define what's going on in the organization. Now, and then the third part of this is going to be the gap. And the gap is simply looking at, if I'm at level 1, I have these type of domains I have to be compliant with. If I want to be level 3, I have these domains. This is where my gap is, and this is what I need to do, and come up with a plan of implementation. And that's kind of the secret that we're actually trying to drive. So when you look at this whole piece of, you know, in terms of how we actually manage CMMC, you're looking at it, it's a process. And there's really is, as you go through this whole model, it's trying to, how do I get to the point? Now, if we did our good job and everyone comes in organizations, you know, we want to write our documents right, we want to write our policies and processes right. And with CMMC, you're going to have to do those things. And we should be doing all this today. It's just like when you look at the CMMC domain and the level 1, for instance, level 1 is really kind of the basic hygiene. And this is basic stuff, is like, do we have personal information in our business? Do we have, have we actually cleaned out Active Directory and make sure all the users that don't exist anymore? Do we have onboarding and offboarding documents for clients? You know, as you go through, how do we actually have which groups? How we're managing websites? How we manage other third-party services? Where is information? What information is putting on what hosted system? And that's kind of the basic thing. Because then what happens is with CMMC, you look at these domains for the different levels, and there's different level requirements that you have, depending what you have to do. Now at KAMIND, we've taken an approach in terms of our security plans, for instance, for a guard security plan, is that we meet like the CMMC level 1, that's what we implement, and then we put the other pieces on top of it. Now, the thing about CMMC, remember the original slide I said it was this, when you talk about process and practices, and process being a maturity process. And this is where what's happened in the past, that things broken down and what they're trying to actually figure out to solve, is that when you look at processes and practices, you have to go through this evolutionary process. So once you get accreditation, it's not a done, you know, point it and done. You have to go through an evolutionary process of security changes and updates and validation that you're doing the things you're doing before you get accreditation. Now, keep in mind, there's third-party assessors that are going to look at these things and look at saying that, okay, I passed you for version 1. Let's go look at 3 years from now when you get up for accreditation again. Oh, you haven't done anything for the past 3 years. You didn't follow any of the processes. You haven't done that. I don't see any collection of data. You will probably not get accredited in year 4. So you have to have a strategy of continuous audit and continuous management. So that's really what the piece. So first of all, you want to kind of figure out your strategy, and you got to look at the timeline. You're going to say how I'm going to use external companies to assist us. How are you going to monitor for audit requirements? You know, what type of contracts? You know, how well structured is your system security plan, and do you fully implement your POAM for your NIST 800-171 filing? And then the other one, do you want to process fast or slow? And keep in mind, our target date is October 1st, 2025. So when you look at this whole timeline, you're looking at this whole point because we're right here right now. There's not that much time between doing full accreditation. And if you want to actually get into the cycle for accreditation for October 1st, you basically, literally, like what we're seeing is that people are starting to say, I want to do a pre-assessment sometime in 2021, and that gets you in the queue to do a formal assessment in 22 or 23. So as you start looking at the time, build that into your schedule so that if you don't start this until 23, then you're basically going to run up this wall right in 24, where basically you're running out of time. And so the question is that with that and trying to understand the timeline, how do you get there? Well, really there's 4 steps. And the 4 steps are, we showed earlier, it's very simple. You want to do a score assessment and figure out where you are. You need to do a scope assessment to say, and that means the data flows and everything associated with it, network diagrams. How do you make sure that where is CUI information? Where is FCI information? And then after you get those pieces on, depending on the level that you're actually going for, you have to do a gap assessment of the scoped areas. And then, of course, the final step is the implementation. So that's really the 4 steps, and very simple. And step 1 is that, really focus. If you have an active contract, you have to file, you have to do this. There's no other, you don't have a option not to. You just have to complete a NIST 800-171 score. And what's happening is that DIBCAC is going to be starting auditing all the folks as they get into 22. So you want to make sure you don't get on the audit list. So you have limited time frames when you want to get this in place. And basically what we see someone does like a NIST 800-171, they're at least thinking about this. They're at least looking at it from a standpoint of, what's the maturity organization, what's in place. They actually have a draft system security plan. They're thinking all the pieces associated with it. And that's kind of the key that we looked, and that tells the maturity of the company too. And the next step after you do from a score assessment, and by the way, all these things you can do yourself on the implementation, the scoping, and everything else. It's very straightforward. There's processes you need to follow, and a lot of information has been published by the federal government how to do this. So after you complete your score assessment, the next step you do a scope assessment. And the big thing in the scope is that you have a Venn diagram, like I have this picture, for instance. I have like the entire company. Well, which part of the organization is going to have both? By definition, you have CUI, you're going to have FCI. So in the green circle, which company is just going to have that? Which part of the company is going to have FCI? What about the other areas? Do I want to scope the entire company? Do I want to reduce the areas? Well, how I want to structure it. So you have to really think about what makes sense for the business, and you have to understand the business. That's why a NIST 800-171 scoring is so important, because it gives you insight to that scoping. And then the questions you ask for it is that what happens in data spills? So data spill is basically make sure that data crosses over, because then you don't want to go through the issue of, there's reporting, there's other issue, and there also may be cases where you may case where the DoD may come in and actually wipe out environments and take equipment. You have to understand what you actually have and what you're focusing on. Now, there's been some estimate on cost structures that we have this, and this is give you a rough idea. This was published under by the DoD and a DFARS case in 2019. And I kind of highlighted certain things that, it's level 1 and 2. This is looking at 365, what we call the general corporate 365. In this area, and that's what we never corporate. In this area, we also have GCC high, because suddenly this is in restricted versions of 365. And by the way, when we talk about these GCC high and the GCC corporate, they are physically different. They're in different data centers. So it's not like you can switch from one to the other overnight. It's literally is a lift and shift, like a whole brand new migration. But when you start looking at the pieces, you're starting to say, okay, what do I actually have to map to? What's going to be the cost per users? And how do you actually get all these various pieces in place? Now, as you get higher into looking at when we talk about 365, for instance, I put a picture that Microsoft just recently published, so you can actually see the different clouds. Now, KAMIND, we actually sell in all the cloud environments. And from a standpoint, when you look at CMMC level 1 and 2, you can get these functionality in the corporate cloud or the Azure commercial, what we call CSP subscriptions. However, if you go to GCC high, this is required if you're going to be CMMC ML3. This is an Azure Government AOSG, which is a unique subscription that has to be purchased. Now, keep in mind, this is a very restricted subscription. You have to be approved to be actually purchased into it by Microsoft and also by and have an active cage code with the federal government. Now, the next piece that you actually have is that looking at trying to understand, so you understand where the different 365s are. And this is important when you actually look at your gap assessment. And the gap assessment and say, you're trying to figure out what controls do I need to implement? How does the company, when you actually, what is the difference? I already know that I'm going to be like ML3. That's great. Now I'm going into a brand new 365 tenant, GCC high tenant. What do I have to change in terms of my business process? What's going to be scoped for CUI? Now you may actually have a model where you actually have your corporate 365 and you build an enclave for the ML3. That's sort of like in terms of what we're doing for ourselves. And those are, so in essence, you're actually kind of reducing the scope. So this is really, as you get those decisions, those play an important factor in the gap assessment, because if you can reduce the assessments, when you actually do the scoring and kind of reduce the size of what you need to score, then your assessment cost is going to get reduced as well. And that's kind of the key pieces. So you go through this process. Now on the expense side, when you look at expensing, the gap assessment is probably the most expensive part of the whole process. Now, once you complete a gap assessment, the final step is basically go implement the scoped areas. And then basically you're going to implement, implement what you want to do. You're going to go and then go through once you get implementation, then you're going to go through accreditation. Then you're either going to put this evolutionary process for active managed continuous audit in place, or you're going to use a third party to do it for you, because you're going to have to put these processes in place to get your accreditation for the 3 years from now, because CMMC is only a certified for a 3-year period. So how does all this work and how does it fit in? That comes down to like what we call the CMMC Accreditation Board process. So when you look at the whole thing that we're actually looking at, is where we see it really in like 3 chunks. You see like the scoring, you see CMC pre-work, and CMC implementation. From how this actually looks from an assessor, keep in mind, whoever implements cannot do the assessment. Now, and that's the way the structure is. And so when you look at what happens in this whole process is once you actually go through a process, you know what your CMC certification level is determined. Then you basically, the contractor implements the practices and process such as KAMIND. And then you go to a self-assessment. Then you actually go through and you pick an authorized C3PO to basically do the assessment that's accredited to do the assessment. And then they basically go through the process and they go issue a certificate that's good for 3 years. So that's what has to be done. So when you actually, it's not just going through an implementation, you have to go through an assessment to make sure it's implemented correctly. And then before you actually get your certificate. Now, so your goal is to get something like this, is that get in this model, because I think you can see now you have a 3-year window once you get accreditation. So you have to actually make sure you're in that window and basically move it forward. So the question is, how do you get started? That's what everyone tends to ask a lot of it. Well, from a DIY approach is that, and I kind of drew the 4 steps. You can actually see it. You can do steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. You can do your scoring assessment. There's documents published on the PI site for the Spurs. You can actually do your scope assessment, and the questions you ask is FCI, CUI. It helps if you have someone who's familiar with this. It kind of speeds the process. And then actually, once you know the scoped areas, then you can actually do this gap assessment. So you remember all those domain charts that we had earlier? You have to actually apply all the different domains. A domain, for example, is that, how am I going to do audit controls? How am I going to track visitor logs? Things like that we should be doing in our organizations as it is. It's just basically formalizing the process. Then once you actually get through the assessment is going to generate a POAM. That's, a plan, operation milestone, and plan implementation for milestones. And what's going to happen on the POAM is that's going to end up things that you're going to need to do for step 4 in the implementation for the scope areas. Now, the tools we use, for instance, we actually use a lot of compliance tools that actually helps you walk you through the assessment, help you walk you through the scope areas and how to get the gap assessments for those things. Then once you get those pieces, then normally what folks do is they'll go through and do a pre-assessment with a C3PO. They kind of check to make sure all the things are lined up before they actually, and then hire a C3PO that's a certified third-party assessor organization that actually going to go do the assessment. And the assessor organization is going to come through and they're going to do the assessment. Says it's basically going to be you pass, you fail, you pass, you fail, and this is what it is. Now keep in mind the assessors, because CMC is a maturity process, they're expecting, and I heard in from our other contacts, anywhere from 6 to 12 months in terms of making sure you have the processes in place. You cannot go through accreditation if you turn around and say, oh, I forgot to do the MFA, put the MFA policy in place and push it out to users. I'll just do it now before the assessor comes tomorrow. Guess what? You'll fail. That's not what the whole purpose of it. There's a process and a requirement, a continuous compliant assessment. And then once you actually get accreditation, you go in step 6, where basically you're going to do this evolutionary process of management again. And then you're going to basically go through accreditation process. And the key thing that you have to do in DYI is really look at which cloud you want to do. Are you going ML1? So that's going to be on the corporate cloud or Azure Commercial, or are you going to be GCC High on the government cloud? So those are choices depending on if you have FCI, which is going to be on the commercial cloud, or maturity level 1 or 2 on the commercial cloud, which is basically FCI, federal contract information, versus CUI, which is going to be on the Azure government. Now, there's a lot of resources available to actually help through this process, and I put a snapshot of thing. You can go to gcap.org and register for them and understand the pieces. There's also in terms of there's an Oregon Manufacturing Extension Partnership that you can actually get grants and everything else to help you, to help businesses with this, that will actually do the implementation, give you grants for the various pieces. Now, we're pretty much predominant KAMIND with Microsoft. And the reason for that is that we use this template. This is known as this Microsoft CMMC Template. And the reason for this is Microsoft is also a federal contractor. And guess what? They use Microsoft 365 E5s. They have to go through CMC accreditation. They're building out the necessary processes and practices they need, the policies and practices they need to put in place. And they're basically they're giving all of us this template. And we're going to have you can actually register and get a copy for that. And that will give you an idea of, if you deploy the Microsoft 365 E5, what do you actually need to go implement? And what do you actually need to go, what is not covered under the 365 stack? And a lot of this is kind of like, there's some things like, how do you actually manual the protection environment, for instance? Do you record visitors coming in? Well, of course, there's no 365 subscription that's going to look at the door locks and figure out who's walking in the facility. But those are the type of things that you have. And how you actually use this placemat, I put a pictorial, it's basically you select the service suites that you want to use. And what that does in this diagram is when you select these service suites, it will actually go through and say, hey, it covers this one, this one, and then basically gives you a description in terms of what the services are. Now, the other service you have on Microsoft with 365 E5, you also have in terms of, you have a plugin for Azure Sentinel. So now you actually have Azure Sentinel where you can actually get to the point of a monitoring of the environment. And so the Microsoft strategy is to build this out so you have an active monitoring. So this is on the Azure Sentinel side. And on the Compliance Manager side, you can actually roll templates. So you can actually build in the model that you actually want to have and start documenting the information associated with it. So really, there's a lot of tools, and fundamentally, you have to kind of look at the organization, say, am I going to be level 1? Am I going to be level 3? And start planning for these things, start developing those policies, start developing those SOPs and how you actually want it, those standard operating procedures and how you want to actually do things. So, it's a process and you got to get started now. So moving with KAMIND, and we'll open it for questions in a few minutes, is that it's the process. And if you want, you can book a 15-minute call today with our registered practitioners. If you're going to know that you're going to have to go to GCC High, then you're going to have to look at a migration. We can handle those things from AOSG moving to GCC High for you. And you just contact us for a readiness check. And the best way to get, if you want a copy of this placemat, this is this document I have in the upper right-hand corner. just go out and fill it, go to kamind.com/feedback, and then we'll send you an updated document for it so you can have the pieces.
Great, thank you, Matt. Good job. Definitely a lot of acronyms and tongue twisters in that presentation. So if anybody has any questions, you can raise your hand or you can hit us in the chat window. Again, I'd like to mention that FCI, federal contract information. So if the federal government's sending you any kind of information, maybe for grants or requests for information, request for quote, anything like that, that is FCI. If you're dealing with blueprints, design docs, anything like that, that would be CUI, controlled unclassified information, maturity level 3. And again, it's just, figuring out which level you need to be at and then implementing the tools to get you there. I also might mention, Matt showed the Microsoft Compliance Manager at the end there. If you're already hitting another vertical industry compliance standard, it's pretty easy to hit the CMMC or any other because they're both built a lot on security and data governance. So once you hit one, it's pretty easy to hit a second, a third. And that's kind of where the IT industry is going these days. It's being driven by compliance mandates. So I'm not seeing any questions yet. Come on, be brave, speak up. Uh-oh, got a question coming.
So if you have an MS365 E5, for instance, and you want to actually go and look at the compliance manager, you can actually basically go to compliance, open up compliance.microsoft.com, and you can actually spin up the compliance manager to see and apply different templates. So if you're actually looking, saying, okay, I want to go against like the Shield law, for instance, in terms of New York, you can apply that compliance template, or the CCPA template, or the HIPAA templates. There's different templates associated in industry, and it's interesting to look at how things are implemented and where you are. And this will give you a good snapshot on some of the pieces.
So our first question, Matt, would be, would one of the first steps in this for, say, our organization to be to find out if we have any of these contracts and how many?
Yeah, that would be the first thing, is that of two types. Is what you want to do is you want to find out, are you actually, do you have any federal contracts or bids that are being put in place? That's probably step number one. And then once you understand that question, you'll understand that really the requirement for level 1 or level 3. Now, on a secondary note, I would say that, all organizations should strive to put like level 1 in place. You don't necessarily need to get the accreditation, but you should be at that maturity level, because that's just good basic hygiene. That's things like, do you got to make sure MFA on? Are you looking at the logs? And there's other types of things which are common sense type of things. That's the way the CMMC specification was written.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matt. Any other questions?
So make sure you put your name in the feedback window, and just get your comments or think there's some other information you want us to add, and we'll provide you a copy of the CMC placemat, which is really a good starting place to really try to understand the pieces and everything else.
And I'd also like to mention this is one of an ongoing series of CMMC webinars we're having. We're doing at least one per month. So the dynamics of it keep changing a little bit. So there's always updates and new information in each presentation. So it pays to attend if you can. All right, I don't see any more questions at this point. Got a few. Okay. I'm getting a lot of thank yous. You guys are more than welcome. Anything else you'd like to add, Matt?
No, just beware, careful of the timelines. There's only so many partners in the US, and there's so many, like the GCC high licenses, there's only like 54 of us right now that are able to sell it in the US. And there's roughly 300,000 companies that have to get accredited. So, you know, if you're looking at the stuff, if your business looking in the environment, you need to do something. My best advice is start early. That's how you're going to keep your costs under control. The more you push it out, and the tighter timeline you get, the more costly it's going to be to implement, if you can actually get into even into the assessment queue. Because the number of assessors who go through 300,000 companies is quite a lot, and it's how much time it takes for each company. So you're talking about, you know, you can actually do the math, but you know, figure that certain assessments, say, depending on the assessment for a 1 or 2 week period, 300,000 companies, you can actually do the math and figure out there's not that many available to go through it. So start now, don't delay. Otherwise, you're gonna find it's gonna be interesting as you get closer to the deadlines.
Excellent point, Matt. And pretty much the answer to our question at the beginning, when should I get started? There's definitely a learning curve here, and we're definitely here to help you with that. All right, well, I don't see any more questions. We really appreciate everybody's time today. Thank you for joining us. And you know how to get a hold of us if you'd like to further engage on this or come up with any other questions. And again, if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, just email me, mcliss@kamind.com. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks again. Bye.